Historically, training for high performance has always been about the cardiovascular system. But what if the very thing that we do every minute of every day, that is breathing, could also positively impact our performance? In today's expert edition, I catch up with exercise physiologist, physiotherapist, and breathing specialist James Fletcher for a deep dive into all things the science of the breath.
Hi, I'm James Fletcher, physiotherapist and exercise physiologist, and you're listening to the expert edition here of the Physical Performance Show, all things science of the breath.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the upcoming Masters Athlete Online Symposium, helping you master your Masters athletes and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes, expert editions, featured performers, coaches' corners, and interest editions. And as per the top of the show, this week's expert edition is an exploration into the science of the breath, with this week's featured guest being James Fletcher, exercise physiologist, physiotherapist, and founder of Fletcher Techniques. By way of bio, James Fletcher has worked with some of the planet's leading athletes across a multitude of sports in helping them bring science to their breath and boost performance through respiratory, or specifically inspiratory, muscle training. James spent years working with elite circus performers in the Cirque Du Soleil, has worked with Australian 100-metre freestyle record holder and Olympian Cam McEvoy, other Olympic swimmers including James Roberts and Madi Wilson, big wave surfers such as Lenny and Ryan Hipwood, and a host of other world-leading performers and athletes. And on this exploration of the science of breathing, we discuss the key question of, can breathing training improve performance? Is there a correct way to breathe? Can and how does strength training improve inspiratory muscle function and therefore performance? Is there a correct way to breathe? Can strength training improve the inspiratory muscles function? The mechanisms by which breathing training can boost performance? What to do if you're feeling a little over anxious? The role of hypoxic training in boosting performance. And there's some great and practical tips for endurance athletes around what to do with our breathing and the role that breathing, consciousness, and specific training techniques can have in boosting our performance. So here is my conversation with James Fletcher on all things the science of the breath. James Fletcher, exercise physiologist, physiotherapist, and breathing specialist. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show as we explore today on this expert edition, all things the science of the breath.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for having me here. It's been fantastic seeing you again.
It's been, I think we roughly calculated about 10 years since we eyeballed each other, both being Gold Coast, Griffith University, physiotherapy, exercise science school graduates. So you've been certainly around the world since finishing uni, and it's probably a good place to start. James, a bit of background on your professional career to date and what led you into this specialisation on all things breathing and athletic performance.
Yeah, Brad, we sort of started at the same clinic as physios, and quite quickly we went our different ways, and I ended up in the circus with Cirque Du Soleil, travelling around the world, and then found myself in a situation where we were in Tokyo with the Fukushima earthquake, and we got evacuated out of Tokyo and taken to Macau for a couple of weeks. In that time period, we were drinking, we weren't training, and the athletes didn't have their focus on the performance. And a lot of those performances in the circus are highly athletic, highly skillful movements that require a lot of training to get themselves up to speed without falling from a wire with no net or trying to hang on to a wheel of death. So you can imagine that sort of training requires a lot of focus and a lot of repetitive training. And at the same time, my mum was diagnosed with a lung disease. So I was in a weird position where I was looking for interventions to improve athletic performance and help my mum as much as possible while being on the other side of the world. So what can I do to help these individuals get back to exercise quicker? And that's something that's really important, and I feel like breath training has a real great focus for people who are, let's say for your type of audience, who have a stress fracture and they don't know what else to do. Great time to introduce some breath training. It reduces shortness of breath, and we'll talk about that later. The second thing, these athletes were about to walk out onto a high wire, and they're practicing backstage, and then the wire starts moving because of an aftershock of an earthquake. So how do these athletes prepare themselves ready for that performance? How do they manage their pre-performance anxiety levels? So these are things I was like, okay, well, it looks like breathing ticks a few boxes in this realm. Maybe this is something that I can deliver to this bunch of athletes that takes care of a lot of the things that these guys are going through currently. So start experimenting with it.
Yeah, wow. So it was a meshing together of your mum's diagnosis with COPD, and just in brief terms, how would, for those that aren't familiar with that as a medical diagnosis, what does that actually look like and mean?
Yeah, COPD is probably the smoker's disease, and it's you essentially get floppy lungs, so you lose the ability for oxygen to be transported across the lungs. So you become short of breath very quickly, and then what we call the shortness of breath cycle, where we get short of breath, we avoid activity that makes us short of breath, therefore we get detrained, therefore we get more short of breath, therefore we avoid more activity. And she lived in a housing commission house in Kingscliff, and I needed her to be able to walk up a flight of stairs.
Gosh, and here you are on the other side of the world working with the best performers physically on the planet. So it's like a continuum of pathology for your mum trying to navigate a flight of stairs and helping Cirque Du Soleil, elite of the elite performers, not get the most out of their performance. So that's quite an interesting position to be sitting in the middle of.
Well, it was interesting because I didn't really know what I was doing when I was doing my circus things, and a lot of the stuff was just trial and error because there was no prescription, there was no pathway for me to follow in that space, and my early works was in disease, and it was in patients with asthma and COPD, because there was a basic framework there to work from, and that allowed me to go, oh, well, I know how to work with this type of patient group. This is what the research is telling me, and the Gosselin article that I'll refer to has allowed me to break down some barriers with breath training. It's a 42 randomized controlled trials, 840 patients, that has definitive evidence that it reduces shortness of breath, it improves whole body exercise, and it improves quality of life for patients if you stick to this regime. And then I was like, all right, well, maybe I can adapt that type of regime for a performance field, and that laid the foundations of my breath work with high performance athletes, which
you've now been really developing, building, and working in the field with some of the world's best athletes across many different sporting endeavours for the better part of a decade.
Yeah, and that really was my passion, was to try and find athletes from different sports, and try and find athletes who were interested in breath training. I burned some through a lot of work, and I mean, as a physio, if you see a particular type of patient over and over, it does get a little boring. So my COPD and my asthmatic patients, I developed a framework for physios to work under, and I said, look, this will change the lives of these patients. Guys, go out there and do it. I'm essentially done with that patient group now, and that sounds a little cutthroat, but I was getting bored of it, but I feel like there was so much value there. And I wanted to unlock this value in different sports with different athletes who are willing to work with me and try some new things out that weren't in the research. Because a lot of the research that I wanted to push didn't exist and still doesn't exist. So, in the last 10 years, working from Canadian biathlon team to sumo wrestlers to Ironman athletes to motocross, BMX, big wave surfing. I feel like the breath has an application in most sports.
So let's go there, James. The breath. I was reminded of its importance in, when you hear psychologists and psychiatrists even prescribing breathing for people with anxiety disorders and different psychological pathologies, which for me was such a reminder of, wow, like the breath, of course. And I think we would all say we know how to breathe. But do we? So can we maybe start there? Like, what is the breath, and is there such a thing as breathing properly?
Yeah, I mean, two interesting components to that, Brad. I think is firstly, the way I talk about the breath is it's like our heart rate. We're all sitting here now listening to this podcast, and our heart's beating, and we have no control over that. So there's an autonomic function there that the brain's programmed, or that the heart has programmed itself for it to work. In the same sentence, until we start talking about breathing, the breath happens. We have no control over it, and for that autonomic function. However, the beauty of the breath is that straight away we can have autonomic control over it, and we can take control of the breath. And it comes from the same place in the brain that our heart rate's driven from. A little bit of a different signaling system, but that's our link back into our brain. That's our link back into our hindbrain, our reptilian focus, our emotional center. And if we can take control of the breath, then we have a lot of the control over our emotions, over our heart rate, and our pre-performance anxiety. So how we feel right now. The breath can tell us a lot about that space, about how we're feeling right now. And that's a tool that we've developed, listening to athletes, to say, well, actually, I don't know if I'm too pumped up before I go into a race, or I don't know if I'm too chilled out. I don't know where I need to be my best version of myself as I line up on the start of a K1000 race. Elise Wood, a great athlete here on the Gold Coast who I've worked with and who has unlocked a new idea in the breath working with her. And that's something that we'll talk about for the guys at the end of the podcast, and I feel like it's a really important function.
So there's the performance aspect, the pre-performance aspect as well, about arousal state, which anyone that's ever stepped on the start line of anything, whether it's at an elite level or just pushing our own boundary level, has felt the anxiety of the start gun, right? So, and I think any parents have ever had a child melting down, it's like, just take deep breaths. So it's almost like we all know this, but I think there's a lot you're going to teach us today around the actual best practical applications of it, James.
Well, on that topic, I think everyone's experienced, and we've probably had this idea about the breath as the brown paper bag. That's kind of has been the breathing, intervention for a lot of people with anxiety. And there's a physiological basis behind the application of the brown paper bag. You know what I'm talking about?
Breathing into a brown paper bag.
Right. So, and this is interesting for the athletes as well, is if we do get anxiety and we lose control of the breath, we overbreathe. And so what we are doing there is we're reducing the partial pressure of carbon dioxide within our bloodstream. And there's physiological changes within the body that we can feel. So if anyone has done Wim Hof, and that's the popularization of breath, you overbreathe, you reduce your levels of carbon dioxide, you change the acidity of your blood, and you will get muscle cramps, and you'll get tingling in the hands and in the small blood vessels. And if you're not prepared for that, then that can fuel that anxiety further, which is why they grab the brown paper bag, and they're essentially rebreathing carbon dioxide to increase the carbon dioxide levels back to a normal state. So that's the physiological basis behind the brown paper bag. But you don't need to do the brown paper bag. You can just, one of the really easy ones is just pursed lips breathing, long exhalations. And that's hard to do if you're in this acute anxiety state, which is why I think a longer term control of the breath and learning how to breathe properly can serve you on a longer term basis. And there is, your question before was, is there a correct way to breathe? And I don't think there's one correct way to breathe. I think it depends on if you're an athlete, your sport. I think it depends on the type of athlete you are, and it depends on the pathology you're dealing with. If you're the everyday athlete, this is the weekend warrior looking to get out, certainly you'll get something from learning how to breathe properly. The way I operate with breath is always trying to make breathing easier.
Make breathing easier. And practically, James, how can that look?
We can practically look at like strength training the breath. So like any sport, if we strength train the muscles that are involved with that specific athletic pursuit, then that type of pursuit becomes easier because the muscles start working at a lower relative max. Or just simple technique changes, using the bigger prime movers of the breath, which is our diaphragm, and moving away from those smaller muscles like the scalenes or the sternocleidomastoid. And the research is pretty clear with that, with their links to neck and back pain as well, longer term neck and chronic neck pain and back pain.
So it's all about making breathing easier as an overarching philosophy when it comes to performance.
Correct.
And then you mentioned, James, there's a strength training side, which just makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, efficiency in any sporting endeavour tends to be found in strength's a big part of it. And then the other part was in technique changes. So let's explore that. But how do you, in your professional work, James, like objectify, test, measure the breath? How do we get a gauge on how well we're doing in that compartment of breathing easy or not? Yeah,
good question. It's there's no objective markers out there that say, well, look, you're Brad, you're 38 years old and you're a runner, you should be at this level. That doesn't exist. I think everyone has the ability to improve the strength of breathing because it's an intervention that's typically not done. So that's straight away, like I feel like I can improve anyone's athletic pursuit by adding some strength training to their breathing. But my overarching philosophy, being making breathing easier, is also bringing science to the breath. The interesting thing about the breath, and which is where it gets a little cloudy in the research, particularly for the listeners who are endurance-based athletes, I will measure your inspiratory muscle strength, your 1 rep max. That's a great measurement tool to see how much weight your breathing muscles can lift. I'll measure your flow rates. So Brad, I'll ask you, how fast can you breathe in if I ask you to breathe in as quickly as you can? I'll measure your volumes. So Brad, I'll ask you, take the biggest breath you can for me. All right, and we'll measure that. There are 3 basic measures. There's also some measures around CO2 tolerance that we'll measure. So that's your body's ability to put up with these CO2 triggers. So that might look like holding your breath. That might look like doing a squat against the wall and holding your breath. That might look at doing some exercise and then holding your breath and then doing some exercise again. So there's different techniques to measure that, and that depends on the sport. For a runner who doesn't hold their breath, it's a really simple test. For a swimmer, a 200-metre fly swimmer, they've got to do a third turn on a 200 fly, a 7.5 second breath hold at max. That's a challenge that they need to work on. So it depends on the sport and depends on the outcomes that the individual wants. But the most important thing is I'll do all this testing, I'll ask the athlete where they want to go, I'll give them a program. And then 3 weeks later I'll get them back. And if I don't see changes in those objective measures, they're either not doing their homework or we have the wrong things that we're working on, and I will change that focus. So it is 100% scientific and objective the way we approach the breath training.
And on each of those there, James, how does inspiratory muscle strength testing look like? What does it practically look like?
So let's just say sucking through a garden hose. I have a specific measurement tool, but it feels like sucking through a garden hose with a golf ball at the end. So you're trying to suck a golf ball through a garden hose. I think
there'll be plenty of people out there trying with a garden hose and a golf ball, and that's like a maximal exertion test.
Correct.
And what are the measurements? What do they come out?
Water pressure. So a typical measurement, if I measured you, I would guess you would be around 150 centimeters of water pressure. On that, there's a good case study. I work with James Roberts, who's an Olympic swimmer. Big guy, he tested 160 centimeters of water pressure. I worked with him for 2 years and we got him to 260 centimeters of water pressure. And that's the biggest change I've seen with someone, but it's also the highest inspiratory muscle strength I've ever seen in any of my athletes I'm working with. Yeah, right. And he's a national level swimmer, Olympic level swimmer, and while we were working together, he got his first national championship. So I felt like I was a part of his journey, whether I was or not. I take little wins where I can.
And an interesting unit, centimetres of water pressure. What's the background there?
I think it's just a measure of pressure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard measure of pressure, and it's the 1 rep max idea. You
Yeah.
know, load up the squat bar. How much can you chuck on and get through 1 repetition? You know.
And how long did it take James Roberts, Australian national level swimmer champion, to increase by 100 units there on the...
The interesting thing about the breath is it doesn't take up too much of an athlete's time to introduce. When I'm asking for an athlete, it's usually about 6 to 7 minutes a day, you know, and it doesn't impact their performance in the pool or on the track. So it's not like I'm adding volume to their sessions. Typically, I'll work with an athlete in the lead up to a competition for 8 weeks. And then once they do their competition, then I won't see them for a while. You know, so this time period was 2 years, but we worked intensively for 3 8-week blocks in the lead up to, I think it was Rio Olympics and then Commonwealth Games, a few of those sort of bigger competitions for himself.
So 3 8-week blocks with a fairly minimal time demand, and as you say, it's not adding another swim session or track session, 6 or 7 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned there's flow rates, and then also volume, and then the CO2 tolerance test as you outlined. What are the underlying mechanisms, James, physiologically that allow for change in making breathing easier? Like, what actually happens?
Yeah, there's a couple of main ones. The first one is reducing shortness of breath levels. So just making your exercise feel easier. And the best way to describe that is if you go for a run and you normally run with your headphones in and you've got a great song playing, the body loses the sense of how the breath is labouring itself, particularly if you're running through, let's say, 400 repetitions. As soon as you start breathing heavy and your brain recognises that, the thing that kept drawing me to the breath was the intricacies and the nuances around how shortness of breath can impact an athlete. So that shortness of breath we can reduce really quickly with inspiratory muscle training or with breath training. So it makes your exercise feel easier. And that's from diseased athletes, diseased patients. That's the primary mechanism of change that we see. So their quality of life improves and their exercise performance improves. And then a runner, if they go for that run, like I said, and they don't have the earphones in and they can hear their laboured breathing, I think a lot of the listeners might relate to that fact that, yeah, actually my exercise feels harder when I can hear my breathing. When as soon as I put my earphones in and I'm in my songs and I'm running away, then exercise maybe feels a little easier. We do that on the physiological level. So that same idea. I don't know if I get that concept across as well as I should.
Yeah, so you shift the perception of effort, but it's not just a perception, it's actually a physiological change, because the bit of research I had preparing for this was that blood flow can be saved from the respiratory muscles that is then available for the peripheral prime moving muscles.
Yeah, that's a little separate topic.
Okay.
That's the second mechanism of change.
Okay.
So the primary one is if we make the breathing muscles more efficient, make them stronger, and we use the right breathing muscles, then the shortness of breath measures that we see during exercise reduce.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
If people have a higher level of shortness of breath during exercise, their performance is going to be impeded.
Yep.
And it depends on what sport you're playing.
Yep.
If you're a high wire athlete and your job is to focus on a wire, and you're puffing, it's going to impede your performance to look at the wire. If you're a triathlete and you've got to make critical race decisions or the transition period or critical places in that race, and you have that shortness of breath increasing because you've just climbed a hill, your shortness of breath during that hill climb will be reduced if you do inspiratory muscle or breath training.
So reduce the shortness of breath aspect of performance.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the second one was about this blood flow
Yeah,
change.
so it's a metabo reflex. It's a reflex within the body when cells become taxed, they ask for more blood. If we make the breathing system easier, and we improve the strength of the breathing muscles, then they're not going to demand as much blood because they're more resistant to fatigue. So the interesting component I found in this was, breathing muscles get tired. I don't know, from a physiological perspective, I loved physiology, and what I got out of my first year of physiology was that we are never ventilatory limited. What I mean by that for the listeners is, no matter how much more breathing you do, you'll never improve your performance, because your performance is limited by your cardiac output, by the delivery of blood with oxygen in it to the muscles that are exercising. That's the limiting factor to performance, right? There's nothing about breathing in VO2 max, right? It's all about the body's ability to get blood, oxygenated blood, and extract that oxygen efficiently. So I was like, well, why are we looking at breathing? Well, because we were never ventilatory limited. But the breathing muscles require blood flow. They take about 16% of blood flow. If we make breathing easier, then won't they take less blood? And won't that blood flow be allowed to go to the exercising limbs? And that's the thing that's been proven time and time again, is this metabo reflex idea. Make breathing easier, the breathing muscles require less oxygen, less blood flow, and that blood flow can go to the exercising limbs. And really interesting studies around, they got people on cycle ergometers and they forced air down their throat. So when that person took a breath, they just pushed it down, so reducing the work of breathing, making breathing easier.
By pushing the air down?
Yeah, yep. And they measured femoral blood flow on the cycling ergometer. And they saw when they pushed air down the throat, more blood flow is delivered to the femoral legs, or to the femur. If they make breathing harder by putting a little pipe on the end of it, blood flow to the legs reduced. So the blood flow and the breathing muscles' demand for oxygen has a direct correlation to the ability of the exercising limbs to receive blood.
And 16% of blood flow, I mean, that's not insignificant.
No.
I mean, is that at rest or is that working? Or
that's working.
Working, yeah.
And that like we just never thought that. My training, in particular university, never looked at the respiratory system. It was always anatomy. This is how we breathe. There was a couple of issues with diffusion capacity. If you have asthma or if you have bronchitis, all these things, it affects your ability to receive the oxygen. But there's never an issue with the amount of, we never get desaturated when we run. We never get desaturated when we swim. So we're never extracting all the oxygen. We're always keeping our supply high. However, that's not the full picture, as I've hopefully tried to explain that.
And any other mechanism, James, by which breathing can be made easier? You mentioned the metabo reflex mechanism you've just shared, and the reduction of the shortness of breath aspect. Is there anything else?
Yeah, when you search for articles around breathing and particularly around the diaphragm as well, one article that springs to mind is where they got people to react to a light on a wall. They got them to shoulder flex, to lift their arm up. And in response to that light, what they did find was the diaphragm switched on before the shoulder did. So before the person got a chance to lift their arm, the diaphragm's role in postural and core stability, it was there. It's essentially the lid on developing core stability. And I worked, again, just from my love of the breath and my love of working with athletes, I worked with some powerlifters and just noticed they all hold their breath. They all try to develop as much intra-abdominal pressure as possible so that they can transfer them pushing through the floor while they're doing a squat or while they're doing a deadlift and move that so that they can move their weight, because they're holding it with their arms. If they lose that and they become floppy through their core, then they can't transfer that force that their big prime movers, their glutes, and their quads are developing that force. So I was like, well, yeah, there's something there. There's something there in developing a strong diaphragm to improve core stability. The research around that is more around back pain. So if people have really short breathing or really shallow breaths, there is a link to back pain there, and that's a Hodges article, so a pretty good article there. But in terms of, and I'm a little bit airy-fairy on core stability as well, but there's something around that space,
If you missed last week's episode 224, featuring Arold Vitan, Triathlon Norway head coach, where Arold shared around his top 3 ingredients for endurance sporting success, then here's a little snippet of my conversation with Arold.
I like to show that I trust athletes. If an athlete comes to me and says, today I'm really tired, I don't think I can do the training session. I trust you when you say today that I'm too tired. You know your body so well. then we take it down.
To enjoy Harold Vighton's highs, lows and learn-ins and our other featured 223 guests dating right back to episode 1 featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day, jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from, and whilst there, if you've been enjoying more than 4 episodes, please consider hitting subscribe to get the show into your earbuds each and every week. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition, James Fletcher, on all things the science of the breath. James, I remember not throughout all my studies, never once thinking about the diaphragm bar physiology in year 1 or 2 or whatever it is, until I got a placement at the Australian Institute of Sport just prior to the Melbourne Commonwealth Games, and Peter Blanche, swimming slash well-touted sports physiotherapist from the Australian Institute of Sport, Peter would work on every swimmer that laid on the table's diaphragm, and that was the first time I'd ever seen that done. And I remember thinking, the diaphragm's important. Well, of course. And he would work on the diaphragm every swimmer that was on the table. So that's the first time I've actually thought about the diaphragm in terms of performance.
And it's funny you said that. It's that avenue for me was one of the first, apart from the Cirque Du Soleil. When I came home, swimmers was my first. It just makes sense. And it's interesting with the swimmers as well, and Blanche's work on the diaphragm, because it's one of the only sports where they almost strength train their breathing muscles because they're put under a time pressure. They've got a short window to grab that breath, so they're essentially power training their breathing system because they're taking a big short breath in. And they're also underwater, so they have a hydrostatic force that essentially is trying to squash their rib cage. So they've got to overcome that force. So it's one of the only endurance type sports where they are strength training their breathing muscles to a small degree. And that's an interesting topic as well, because the research is really clear about strength training the breathing muscles. I get a lot of questions about the hypoxic masks and all that sorts of things. Like, is this a type of strength training? The research is really clear. It has to be over 30% of their 1 rep max. So first of all, you have to know what the 1 rep max is, and then second of all, you have to put that load on the inspiratory muscles.
And practically on that, people will be listening, appreciating that there's a role here for performance optimization. How can they assess that 1 rep max if so they didn't have immediate access to someone like yourself who's a rare diamond in the field as it is? What can they do, James?
There's a new breath device out. It's called AeroFit. That allows you to test your 1 rep max. It's $400, I think it is. That's not a bad place to start. The other way to do it is to use a power breathe device, and you can do it online. So I can watch someone breathe and I can see their failure point. So I'll ask them to do certain things and then turn it up, make it harder and make it harder. And as soon as they transition, you'll see their upper respiratory muscles just start working from the start. So they're essentially failing with their diaphragm accessibility. And that's a really good method to sort of not get an objective measure, but a qualitative measure of, okay, I think this person is around this space. Alternatively, there's devices that I have where we test patients in a clinic and get them to do the test. You might be able to do it from your GP as well with a lung function testing unit. So it's not a spirometer where we're assessing exhalation, it's the opposite. So we're assessing inhalation. So patients might be able to access it through their GP. And
I think many people will have probably tested at some point an exhalation device, as you say, a spirometer with the little floaty balls there, and there's also the lung function, the maximal exhalation pipe, is it? Pico, yeah. So all right. And then you said, James, that the load has to be great enough, 30% greater than their, did you say 1 repetition max?
Yeah.
So how practically might someone be able to train along those lines?
Yeah, so it has to be like with any strength intervention. Going to the gym, I don't see many people lifting the barbell up for 100 times. What type of intervention or what type of stimulus is that for the body to respond to? It has to be heavy, because that's what strength training is. So that might look like for someone, the prescription is 30 breaths in the morning. So you have to just be able to finish 30 breaths on an inspiratory muscle trainer. So, if you do 30 squats in the gym, the 27, 28, 29 squats, you're almost falling over. It's the same idea with breath training. It's the same stimulus. And what we've started to experiment with is, strength training is a type of stimulus that's given in the gym. What other types of stimulus have we seen that have come from the gym? Power training, explosive, proprioception. All these other types of ideas we are bringing to the breath. So depending on the person's outcomes, depending on the person's sport, we will prescribe them different ways to improve their performance. And that's the cool bit, because there's absolutely no research out there on that stuff.
And so it's really just pioneering type of work, but also being measured in your sense, because you've got some objective data to see if there's a change. But for someone listening in, it could be as simple as, you mentioned the power breath device.
Yeah.
Are they readily available?
James? I think there's a new distributor in Australia. The Power Breath device is under $100 or around $100, and then really accessible unit for individuals to start their breath training journey. But I would put a caveat on that is, I started using these devices 11 years ago, and I thought that I knew what I was going on with, and I was a physio and a physiologist, and I made lots of mistakes in my early journey with breath training. If anyone's had a diaphragm cramp before, you're essentially folded over in half because your diaphragm's in spasm, and that takes 20 minutes to recover from, and not very pleasant. Also, overdeveloping your upper respiratory muscles, so your neck muscles, you can get some pretty nasty headaches and nasty triggers through your scalenes and through your sternocleidomastoids and upper traps if you don't have the proper technique. So I would, as any strength training program, start light and then take your journey with you. And it should be around an 8-week journey for you to improve your breath training strength and your technique. And
that could be as little as 6 or 7 minutes in the case of James Roberts, or 30 breaths you just threw out before.
30 in the morning and 30 at night. That's the intervention. You know, if you need more, like you're a swimmer or a freediver or big wave surfer, you need other things that breath training delivers: CO2 tolerance tables, intermittent hypoxic training, power type breathing, breath training while you're working. And that's another really great example where your endurance athletes might really find a session where they're just focusing on their breath, where the classic one is just taping the mouth shut, you know, and that forces you to focus on the breath. And that's something that maybe people don't do. You know, if it's a recovery run, I'm just going for 5Ks, no time limit, I'm just going to enjoy this run, tape your mouth shut. See what happens.
So interesting. One of the very popular experts on the show to date, James, Dr. Stephen Seiler, the polarised training forefather, if you like, American-born, now Norwegian-based. Stephen, I have seen on Twitter, often post up, I did a 2-hour ride today, 100% exclusively breathing through my nose on his trainer. And Stephen's linking that into the perception of effort. He knows he's overdoing it, if obviously he's finding that difficult. So it's just really interesting. You might start to see some runners running around the block with their mouths taped up.
I think it's a really neat intervention that is really easily accessible, and it could be someone's first journey into focusing on their breath, you know, because it's probably a great lead into one of the things where endurance athletes can suffer from, which is, you know, hyperventilation, and particularly dynamic hyperinflation. So it's the same idea that happens in a patient with COPD, where they have these floppy lungs. They can't get all of their air out. If we have an endurance athlete that's working at that anaerobic threshold, so their ventilatory demands are really excessive, are really high, they might be overbreathing. And if they're overbreathing, then their blood supply and their blood delivery to the breathing muscles is oversupplied. What can happen in that scenario is that the individual won't have enough time to get all their air out. So they end up breathing at high lung volumes. So instead of, like me here, breathing at my low lung volumes, what a hyperventilation patient athlete will do is they'll just keep breath stacking, and they'll be at the top of their lung volume like that, and then they're taking breaths up here. So they've got all this lung volume that's taken up, and now you imagine trying to move when you're already full. That work of breathing super high, super increased from working at lower lung volumes. And then you've still got all this dead space in there that the patient can't get rid of. So
they're working at lower lung volumes. How would and we're talking endurance athletes, and let's go with runners, large proportion of listeners of the show are runners. How would a runner know if they are in this hyperventilation pattern? Because when you're working hard, this feels hard. You're short of breath.
Breathe out. Breathe out. Just get rid of all the air. Hyperventilation, they'll be stacked full of air.
Okay.
Right? And for some reason, they might hit like a plateau, or there might be a hill that they just really struggle with, you know. Take the mouth shut. Go for a long, slow run over that roll, over that hill or over that run, and see what normal breathing patterns or a normalized approach to breathing looks like. It usually is at like that really high level marathon, 5,000 meter, you know, you're working at really close to that anaerobic threshold. And you just breath stack, you know, so,
okay.
And it could be it could be like a 2 or 3% breath stacking intervention where you've just got this low level of volume that doesn't move and you're operating at this higher lung volume. That costs more energy, you know, so get all the air out and then operate from that level.
And getting the air out, you mean whilst running?
Yeah, breathing out. So pursed lips, longer exhalations. These are some of the things that I'll pass on to the listeners at the end in terms of some expert tips around the breath.
So pursed lips plus longer expirations. And James, in this very comprehensive scientific review, the systematic review and meta-analysis published in 2013, where they looked at a bunch of sports around, it's titled The Effects of Respiratory Muscle Training on Performance in Athletes, a systematic review with meta-analysis. What were some of the findings from, say, cycling, running in this analysis?
Yeah, again, there's the same ideas where we see reductions in shortness of breath across the board. We see improvements in whole body exercise, and it just makes their exercise feel easier. You know, if they can get control of their breath, or they improve the breath system's ability to take a breath in, a larger breath, shallower breaths, quicker air in, or more efficient with taking air in, then exercise feels easier. So that allows these athletes to go even harder. And there's really interesting discussion around the central governor hypothesis, where, you know, we place restrictions on ourselves because of what we've seen, what we've felt before, you know, what our parents have done, what our coaches tell us can be done. And I think that the breath has a really unique way to unlock the central governor idea and allow athletes to effectively, not much time spent on it, unlocks potential that is just stored within their brain or stored within their body. I think that's a really interesting idea around breath training.
And the central governor hypothesis, how would you describe that, and what is it about it that matters to the, you know, recreational athlete out there trying to perform at their best?
Yeah, I think the best way I try to describe it is, for years, the freestyle motocross athlete. So there's not the everyday athlete. One person did a backflip, and then straight after that, 3 or 4 people did backflips. So what was it about that first individual to do the backflip that unlocked the potential of these other athletes to do the backflip? So what was that journey for that individual that allowed him to say, well, actually, I'm going to be the first person to do this. Well, my body can do this. My brain can do this. And I think a lot of athletes put limits on themselves based on, like I said before, what their coaches say, what they've seen before in the news, what they've experienced in their own training levels, what is out there in the environment and in the culture that they work in. And I think that breath has a really unique aspect to unlock some of this potential, because it does open up new avenues and it makes exercise feel easier, and they could possibly be in a better headspace when they're doing their exercise and can give that extra like 2 or 3%, which gets them, you know, across the line a little. Oh, actually, I just broke 3 minutes, or you know, I'm doing my 3-minute Ks and I'm holding that for my 10 or 15 Ks now. Like, that's fantastic. It's an idea that I really like jamming on.
Yeah, and the central governor hypothesis being that it triages.
Well, our brain just stops us from doing the things that we want to do because of our past experiences or the limitations we put on ourselves. You know, it's no, you can't do that because why?
Yeah.
Just because.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, we've seen it obviously recently in the marathon, and now you've got juniors talking about, you know, my goal is to be the next to run the sub 2, but in a race rather than a stimulated time trial.
Yeah.
To
break down that barrier, you know, it's become accepted, and now people are like, oh, I can do that.
Yeah.
It was there all along. You could have done it all along, but you were putting those same limitations on yourself.
The bit that staggers me is in elite performance and sport, and anyone out there, time poor, the recreational athlete, how things such as some degree of trainability around the breath can be ignored across the board by so many, if not everyone, for so long. How do you break that down? Just more of a, I guess, a philosophical type musing, but how can something so obvious be ignored and left unexplored relatively?
I think it starts from just the earlier discussion around the physiology being we're not ventilatory limited. So we're always looking, that's the physiology, you overbreathe, or there's never, you're always taking enough oxygen in, you're never limiting the amount of oxygen, so why would we look to improve that? So I think that's the first idea from physiology, where it's like, we won't even look at that.
Because, and just to explain that in a bit more detail, James, not ventilatory limited, you mean we never thirst for a breath.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean that we can't make that breath easier or more efficient.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So in physiology, first year, that's what you learn. It's like, you're taking enough breaths for your exercise wherever you're at. And that anaerobic threshold mark is not driven by more or less breathing. It's driven by your body's ability to deliver the blood to the exercising limbs, and then those limbs to extract that oxygen efficiently.
So let's put the emphasis on making that deliverability of the blood better through, getting fitter and, being stronger. But it's interesting, I get asked quite regularly, as someone that sort of works in the vertical of running and endurance sports as a physio, how should I breathe when I run? And the best I've got, James, is just do it. It'll take care of itself. Yeah. If you run harder, it will be supplied, and if you're running steady, it will figure it out as well.
But that's not really the case. It's interesting. It's like, we don't know, below anaerobic threshold, we don't know why our ventilation increases in response to exercise. So we don't know, which is interesting. Like, that opens up a lot of gates for us. So the hypotheses and the start to understand that is, they think because of the muscle receptors are sending information to the brain, the respiratory system within the brain starts to feel that and go, okay, well, we actually need to increase our breathing in response to these muscles sending us information. The more muscles working, we think the more information's coming in, the brain's like, well, actually we need to breathe a little bit more. However, over anaerobic threshold is a clear line, it's backed with CO2. So as our CO2 levels start to increase above anaerobic threshold, so we're starting to consume, we're starting to not use oxygen as our main energy source, then the breath predictably matches our CO2 levels increase. So we know that CO2 is a really powerful trigger for the breath. But again, there's a lot of science that's missing in that space. And it was only last year that some people won the Nobel Prize for looking at the lack of oxygen's role, or how the body detects reductions in oxygen, and then how is that a stimulus for our body to improve. Like going to lift a weight, we know that when we lift a weight, the body's response is to grow bigger muscles, to grow stronger tendons and stronger bones. How does the body know that there's a reduction in oxygen, and what is the body's response to that? We didn't really know that before these guys found this hypoxic induced factor within the blood or within the tissues. And now that's a signal that in order to create a response, or like any training, it's stimulate and then the body responds, and then that response is your growth as a performance athlete, or growth in your muscle size, or whatever that growth is. It's only been unlocked in the last couple of years, and it won the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, so interesting. So a lot of work to be done. Clearly, James, practically, you mentioned the term hypoxia there as well, and it'd be good to explore that if we can. But practically, how would you instruct a runner to breathe?
Yeah. So for us, I would probably tell a runner to take their mouth up and do their recovery run. Okay. And just to see what that feels like for that individual. If I was instructing a runner, practically I would just ask for longer exhalations and get in rhythm with your stride. Breathing, I feel like, is all about rhythm. Try and breathe from your lower lung volumes so that you're not increasing the work of breathing, and try and increase your exhalation time. And
you mentioned breathe from your lower lung volumes. How does that practically, is that a thought process, trying to breathe into the bottom of the lungs, or breathe out of the bottom of the lungs? Or
all of the training I do, I liken it exactly to strength training. If I'm got my runner on a squat rack, like I don't translate the squat to a run. Right? They don't. It's strength training here. You're running techniques over here.
Yep.
I will strength train and breathing technique in the clinic, and however they breathe during a run, I'll let that happen. So in terms of technique space, I wouldn't, unless there was something critically wrong with that runner's breathing technique, it would be more around long exhalations, breathe all the way out every now and then, because you might be breath stacking or in that hyperventilation space.
And people often ask, should I breathe in through the nose and out through the nose, or in through the nose and out through the mouth, or in through the mouth and out through the mouth? Would you add anything to that?
Just do what feels good.
Yeah, okay, so I'm off the hook there.
Well, there's some evidence around nitric oxide production and improving improving of efficiency of oxygen to the cells. I work with boxers, so they've been punched in the nose and they can't breathe through the nose, and they're some of the best boxers in the world. For me, I don't think it's a critical issue for me. And in fact, if your listeners do it now, like if you breathe in fast through the nose, there's resistance there. If you breathe in fast through the mouth, there's less resistance there. So am I increasing the work of breathing by breathing through my nose?
You're listening to James Fletcher, exercise physiologist, physiotherapist, breathing specialist, on this expert edition on all things the science of the breath. Support for today's show comes from the upcoming 8th of August Masters Athlete Online Symposium. If you are a Masters athlete or a health or fitness professional working with Masters athletes, you are not going to want to miss this world-first, one-day online event designed to help you master Masters performance. The event features 16 world-leading experts across a range of disciplines: psychology, psychiatry, rehabilitation, exercise performance and physiology, and so much more. Registration for this event is free. To register, jump over to masterathletes.online. That's masterathletes.online. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's award-winning online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete frustrated with a bone, tendon or joint-related concern, then rest assured our online consultations are remarkably effective, cost-efficient, and can be booked online over at pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with James Fletcher on this expert edition on all things the science of the breath. You mentioned about pursed-lipped breathing there before, James. And that was, I think, a strategy for, say, pre-performance anxiety.
Yeah.
Can you share a few practical tips? We're on the start line. We're a little bit freaked out at what we're about to do.
Yeah.
What would be James Fletcher's tips?
I'd start a little bit before I was on the start line. Let's say we're just warmed up and we're 10 minutes before kickoff or before the start line. A really unique tool that we developed, and this is with Elise Wood, was just the exhalation pause. So if an athlete wakes up in the morning, if they're about to perform, they breathe all of their air out and they just start counting in their head. And they will get to a number where they need to take another breath. And after developing that and doing that for a while, their number will become really familiar to them when they feel really comfortable. And so my number's 17. So when I breathe out, I just count in my head, and it's my own count. I don't look at a watch. And then when I get to 17, I will feel the urge to breathe if I'm in my good space. If I'm stressed and I'm anxious, then my number's going to reduce. And if my number's 6 or 7, I know I need to do something to calm myself down before my performance. If I know my number's 20, if it gets to 25, so I'm super mellow and I don't need to take, then I might not be pumped up enough for my race. And then every individual is, some people listen to hip hop music and they're shadow boxing and they need to be super, pumped before their race. That's their strategy, that works for them. Some people need to be super mellow, but you should know what your number is for your performance level. And that's a really unique tool, and I like this to, the story of Clint Robinson in the Atlanta Games. Like, for the 3 days leading up to the race, he was measuring his heart rate, and it was 3 beats over normal. And he didn't train or didn't race for 3 days, first 3 days before the race. Gets up the day of the race, heart rate's bang on, wins gold medal. It's just that athlete knowing their body so well. An athlete should know their number. They don't need to put a heart rate on or anything. It's just how they're feeling, and that can be influenced by environment as well.
The exhalation pause, and you'd say, James, start athletes can start doing that straight away.
Yeah.
And would it matter that it was measured at the same time to get a bit of a feel for this each day, or it doesn't because there's different stressors at different times?
Yeah, different stresses, different times, and you have a coffee, your number will change, because that caffeine drives that a little. It's really nice in the morning when you get up, and then I would just do it before I jumped in the pool or before I went for my run, and you'll just start to get really familiar with your numbers, and then you can check in with yourself really easily. You're heading into a big meeting, breathe all the air out. All right, I'm at my number. I know I'm good. I know I'm ready to go. Or your number's a bit high. You need to go and do some breath work to calm yourself down again, or put your earphones in and chill out. Or I'll be there in 5 minutes, guys. I've got to go to the toilet, and just get a bit of space for yourself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, James. It might seem like an obvious question, but the breathing muscles get tired. I think you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, but they
do.
I got super nerdy on the breath when I first dug into it, and they get tired. So even after 2 minutes of breathing heavily, you test the breathing muscles before and after that, and you'll see a reduction in your ability to lift a heavy weight. So you won't be able to lift the same weight. So much so that they can, if I test and fatigue your breathing muscles now, and then I ask you to go for a run, it'll be a poorer performance. So that breathing muscles have the direct ability to improve your performance or impede your performance, depending on their strength or on their capacity to be technically a good breath. So pre-performance, if we fatigue the muscles beforehand, the breathing muscles, our performance reduces. If we strength train the breathing muscles and make it breathing easier, we improve our performance. And yes, they do get fatigued even after 2 minutes of exercise or heavy breathing.
Wow, so hence the need to pay some attention to the trainability of the breath.
Yeah.
James, what would you say would be I'm going to push you here, this is going to be challenging, but the top 3 mistakes that you see, it can be athletes or endurance athletes specifically, make around their breath?
I think this is a little bit not just focused on the breath, but prioritising sleep and recovery. I have that breathing as a tool to improve my sleep. What happens when we go to sleep is it's another whole podcast, and I've done a lot of work with sleep, but the breath can be really important to set your body up to have a good night's sleep and a good night rest. So I think that is really important, and particularly these days where maybe a lot of the younger athletes are stimulating themselves with iPads and iPhones and all this sort of garbage before they're heading to sleep. That can really impact their sleep health. So I would have a routine around sleep and breathing before going to bed. Listening to their body, so that exhalation pause, and aim for small improvements each week rather than large improvements very quickly. And that's probably something that many of your guests have said. It's those smaller improvements that manifest over time, that compound interest, which is what allows athletes to be the best version of themselves. So, have a number, prioritize, listen to your body, and know what you should feel like if you're going into a hard week, to an easy week, or into a recovery week, and pay close attention to that. And as a physio, I'm sure you see a lot of niggles coming in, and really good athletes just know their body so well. They're like, actually, this is just feeling a little weird. As a physio, you get in there and you make some changes, or you find actually it's your right calf's tightening up, which is not allowing you to do this and this and this. So picked up early, stops an injury and makes them gain that little bit extra percentage. And the last I would do is just pay attention to the breath. So if you are a swimmer or a runner or a cyclist, a triathlete, try that taping of the mouth and just see how that can draw your attention to the breath. I wouldn't necessarily do it for a performance set, and there's a lot of early work done in hypoxic work when they take people up the mountains, and they generate more red blood cells, and then they come back down. So we don't want to, and the way I philosophize is I don't want to impact someone's performance set, right, with breathing. I just want them to pay close attention to it, and then their body will take it on as it needs to. So pay attention to the breath, work out a rhythm, and control the expiration. That's, I guess, the message from that.
We've just hosted Dr. Stephen Seiler, acclaimed sports scientist, for his 3-hour live stream event, Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goals. The live stream was a fantastic success, so thank you for everyone who took part and all the team behind the scenes. We had well over 350 people across the globe, coaches, athletes, health and fitness professionals tuning in. And the good news is the team have been working hard to make the live stream available for ongoing access. To purchase access to the Dr. Seiler Sustainable Training for Attainable Endurance Goal workshop, simply jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Seiler live stream. James, briefly, hypoxic training, I think anyone with an interest in physical performance at some point will have thought about that side of training. I think everyone intuitively feels like there's something there. Like, if I can do some hypoxic breath training, whether you're an Olympic swimmer or a recreational athlete, we've all tried to hold our breath at things, right? Yeah. How is there any overlap or any advice you might give to the listener of the show around incorporating some hypoxic work?
Yeah, do it with someone watching you, because that can be quite dangerous. But this is where I think a lot of the research needs to head towards, is this hypoxic work, where it's a really unique stimulus to the breath. It's a really unique stimulus to the body, sorry. It's simulating altitude training. So we know what happens with altitude training. The body's stimulus is to produce more red blood cells. That red blood cells allows you to improve your aerobic capacity because you actually can carry more oxygen. I think the really interesting stuff is this intermittent hypoxic work, where we're working hard or we're limiting our recovery, and we're asking the body to perform things under certain stresses. That's a new stimulus for the body. And that work with the Nobel Prize, looking at that hypoxic induced factor, and how the body responds to a hypoxic environment, can be like a splenic release of red blood cells. It can be improving your ability to carry oxygen. So I think there's some really fantastic work that we're doing with athletes, and that the research is doing as well, looking at how can we simulate altitude training in a short-term environment to get those same benefits.
Through hypoxic training?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the definition of hypoxic training?
It would be holding your breath during high-intensity work, or limiting your recovery so that your oxygen levels don't ever respond back to normal. So the body's like asking for more oxygen all the time. And like any sort of strength work or type of work, what's the stimulus for the body and how does the body respond? So that hypoxic work, what are we after for the body? We want it to produce more red blood cells. We want it to improve its ability to carry oxygen and be more efficient with that transaction at the level of the tissues. So give me that oxygen straight away. I want to get it and use it as my energy source. But it's awesome. It's cool stuff.
Yeah, gosh, so much there. James, Fletcher, every guest of the show does two things. One is issue the listener with a physical challenge of the week. But before we go there, what would your one piece of advice be, James, to listeners of the show across all your learning so far from your career to date to help them perform at their physical best?
The best athletes that I've worked with, and I saw this when I first started working with Grant Hackett, and then I see it consistently with the athletes who are on their journey to success, is they listen, they ask questions, and they get inquisitive about themselves and about their performance, about their training, about their coach's attitudes, about their own attitudes. So they're always asking questions. And think of yourself like a business. So there are many competitors out there aiming for the win. They have access to the same raw materials, the same coaches, the same types of environments. But what actually makes a successful business is a different model. So what is the stimulus that works for that individual? Keep asking those questions, even if you think you're at the top of your game. Keep asking those questions. Keep exploring new avenues of training, and you'll know what works for you. And that might be the thing that ticks you over that 1 or 2% to be a successful athlete, or to continue to be a successful athlete as you get older and more challenging.
Oh, that's so rich. Listen, ask questions, explore. I think of some athletes over the years, and yeah, there's a theme of inquisitiveness and not resting with the status quo, or not just taking something at face value, always exploring, quizzing, questioning. It's so interesting. James, physical challenge for the week. How are you going to challenge the listener of the show? And I have a feeling it's going to be something related to the breath.
I think the first one would be that exhalation pause. So just start adapting that and bringing that into your routine, whether it's before you go to sleep, when you wake up, or before your performance set of the day. Start to know your number. I think that's a really important one. And I'll give listeners another, because I mentioned how important it is around sleep, and it almost tacks onto this idea of this exhalation pause. So five breaths, a normal breath in, and then a really long exhalation, and that might sound and feel like this. So that's how long I want the exhalation to be. I want them to do that 5 times. At the end of that 5th breath, I want them to hold their breath until their body asks them to breathe again. And I just want them to keep them doing that until they fall asleep.
And James, just so we can get the rhythm, can you kindly do that one more time?
Yeah, so a normal breath in, and then a breath out. Long exhalations. At the end of the 5th one, hold the breath on the exhale, and then repeat that. And that's a really nice way to transition the body from a sympathetic fight or flight response into a parasympathetic rest and digest mode. So just taking all of that stress out of the body. So don't stress, don't hold the breath until you need to take the breath in. As soon as you feel the body asking for a breath, give it to it.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. James Fletcher, it's so practical, and I think you'll see, you might even hear people doing that through bedrooms across the country and around the world, and if not, we'll definitely see runners running around with tape on their mouths and know why. If listeners of the show want to find out more, and I'd encourage listeners to do this, where can they find out more about you and what you're up to in this exploration of all things the science of breath?
Yeah, so all the athletes that I work with, I post a lot about on Instagram, and that's Fletcher Techniques. And like I said, I'm always inquisitive about working with new athletes in new sports in particular. So if they wanted to reach out, certainly can help them. I do on my webpage, fletchertechniques.com. So I regularly write blogs about interesting things that come up about the breath, like that Nobel Prize or intermittent hypoxic work, or the latest tragedy that we saw here on the Gold Coast with Chumpy Pullen and shallow water blackout, which is working in that space of hypoxia. You definitely need to know what you're doing, and working with someone's really important, because it's after that story and hearing so many other lives lost in that space doing hypoxic work, it's devastating.
Yeah, so reach out, get informed. And James Fletcher, thank you for your contribution to the Physical Performance Show, and keep up the great work on all things the science of the breath.
Thanks, mate.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. What a fascinating look into something that I think we'd all agree is largely and often overlooked. It certainly has been from my desk, but my conversation with James will really have me thinking differently about the role of respiratory and inspiratory muscles with regards to our performance. Now, if you do take on James's fantastic expiration pause physical challenge, then please reach out and let James know. You'll find James over on social at Fletcher Techniques, Fletcher Techniques. You'll find the Physical Performance Show over on social at Physical Performance Show on Instagram, and at The Physical Performance Show over on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at TPPS1, and do tag the show in and keep the podsies coming of a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying. They are always so much fun to see coming through. Another reminder, if you did miss the ever-popular Dr. Stephen Seiler on the recent 3-hour live stream event, then do not panic. It is now available for post-live stream purchase over at pogophysio.com.au/live stream. You'll gain access to the PDFs and the full live stream presentation for the ongoing low ticket price of $49. Don't forget to register for the free upcoming Masters Athlete Online Symposium being put on by the Physical Performance Show and Function to Fitness, Benoit Matthew, prior featured expert of the show and UK-based physiotherapist. It's coming up on the 8th of August. Registration is free and you'll have access to 16 world-class leading experts and speakers on the day. Massive thanks as always to the great folk who make the Physical Performance Show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design, and Lily Burden on all things social media. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we keep the Expert Edition theme running, literally running. I'll share with you a conversation that I had recently with Canadian-based physiotherapist and running researcher JF Esculier on the topic of, is running bad for your knees? Can running result in knee osteoarthritis? Here's a little snippet of my conversation with JF Esculier.
And they had over 125,000 people included in that systematic review, and they categorized people in three different categories. So number one is recreational runners. Number two was more controls, non-runners, sedentary people, and competitive runners. And they looked at how many people in those different categories showed changes on X-ray that were related to knee OA.
JF is world regarded for his leading research. It's a conversation not to be missed. Let's set the record straight on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.